So hello everyone, it's a pleasure to have you here. We have the next webinar of October with our presenter, which is also the current president of SIETAR Europa, Tamara Thorpe, who's joining us from Ireland today. And we're going to hear her webinar about promoting age inclusions in the new millennium. Tamara, it's your turn.
Thank you, Gradiola, and welcome everybody. I appreciate you all being here. I don't want to talk too much about myself, the bio's on the website, but I will share that I've started doing a lot of work around age inclusion and leadership development for young professionals about 10 years ago, when I really started to see how there was an increasing pressure among millennial leaders to really have a set of skills in terms of leadership that they were really struggling to learn and practice in their own leadership roles, and also sort of the challenges that started to arise in teams and organizations around age difference. And so from that really inspired me to look at, as experts in the field of intercultural competence and diversity inclusion, how do we take what we know from the work that we've done across cultures and apply that to the challenges we're seeing within organizations on age difference. And probably in the last 5 years, I know that there's been an increasing demand on practitioners to address age diversity in the workplace. And so I'm really happy to be able to share what I've come across in my research and what I've developed in terms of my own practice with each of you today. So there'll be some opportunities for questions at the end, and feel free to post questions throughout if they come up, and I'll do my best to pause a couple times, see if we might address some of those. So I want to start with kind of where we are today and what's the difference. A lot of people for many years invited me to come to their organizations to talk about millennials, and they really wanted to understand this mysterious generation. But what I found was really important was that it wasn't that millennials were so different than other generations. It's that the environment in the workplace is really different than it used to be. And one of those differences comes from there being multiple generations in the workplace. And what happened with the global recession in 2008 is it created this VUCA environment that we're seeing in organizations and in global markets that have created a kind of volatility where we're seeing speeds of change in industry and in the marketplace that is much more rapid before. So when we think about something like banking and commerce, and we think about how much that has changed from everything from Bitcoin to phone apps like Revolut, where you're able to just use your phone to pay for things, that we're really starting to see some of those things change very quickly. And this has created quite a bit of uncertainty in the marketplace, where organizations have a shorter lifespan, they're moving quickly, and that's created uncertainty, and as a result, a lot of complexity. And as we know as interculturalists, when you add that uncertainty and complexity together, it creates ambiguity. And really having the skill set to manage uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity is what a lot of people in the business world have not developed, which is a lot of the work that we do as intercultural practitioners. And so when we think about organizations and the challenges they are having across generations, one of those things for us to really think about is how have these changes in the economy and how businesses run really affected and drive how different generations are perceiving their experiences. And I'll try to talk a little bit about that today. Because a lot of what we're seeing is not so much about what millennials and Gen Z are bringing that's different, it's what the environment is doing that's different. So what really is new and different? So we know that there are now up to 4 and 5 generations in the workforce today, because people have stayed in the workforce longer, when before the recession there was an anticipation that people would be retiring. But now we have more people who have stayed in the workforce, and so organizations have more age diversity than ever before. We know that millennials are the largest segment of the workforce in the United States, surpassing baby boomers, with being 53.5 million millennials in the workforce. We also know that 45 million baby boomers have remained in the workforce, and Generation X is holding steady at about 52.7 million. And so we really have not one particular group dominating. And then, of course, we know that iGen is coming, and they're going to be the fastest growing segment of the workplace over the next 10 years. So what is a millennial? What's a boomer? What's a Gen Xer? So there's lots of work by generational researchers. There is some variation. This is the time frame that I use, and you'll see different paradigms that might look similar, plus or minus 1 or 2 years, but this is what I generally use as my operating guide. And then, of course, there is a population between Gen X and millennials that now currently identify as Zennials, because they no longer, many people in that group don't feel like a Gen Xer, and they don't feel like a millennial. And part of that comes is because change is happening much more rapidly. So how relevant the 20-year cohort will last in generational research is interesting to see how that holds steady over the next few years. We also know that age discrimination is a real fact in today's organizations. We know that people are discriminated because they're too young and because they're too old. And the research is really clear that millennials are feeling the stress of being called out, to being identified as a problem group or a problems generation. And that this has had an impact on recruitment, retention, morale, and engagement, which I'm sure many of you have heard from your clients as real issues that they are dealing with within their organizations. And I want to take a quick pause because I'm seeing lots of things pop up in the chat box. Are there any questions that have come up that would be important for me to address now, Gradiola?
No, we just have a fairly small technical problem with one of our participants, but our great technician Steve is trying to help with that, so hopefully that's gonna be resolved soon.
Perfect, thank you. Just wanted to make sure I wasn't leaving anybody behind. We also know that there is age discrimination against those older generations. In the United States, there's an organization called AARP, and they provide resources and services to older Americans. And they conducted a survey on age discrimination in the workplace last year that was incredibly revealing. And in their report, they found that in a survey of adults over 45 years old, 61% said they have either seen or experienced age discrimination in the workplace. And more than 50% of older workers who have seen or experienced experienced age discrimination say they believe it started for them when they were in their 50s. Only in their 50s, I'll say, because I just turned 50. And that there's also, of course, a difference in perception around age discrimination based on gender. So while 72% of women between the ages of 45 and 74 think they've faced age discrimination, only 57% of men in the same age range have said they've experienced age discrimination. And then, of course, we know that this number goes up for women of color. So older women, African Americans, and Hispanics within the United States who identify that way feel that they've experienced more discrimination. So this is something that in terms of the work we do, we know that there's a real demand, not just about addressing a particular cohort, but really about addressing how organizations perceive age, if they're applying bias to how they do things in their organization that are related to age. And so part of what I have found in my work is that it's far more important to foster age inclusion in the work environment for organizations to really be high performing and to be as productive and inclusive and to have positive work cultures. There are a lot of, as we all know as practitioners, when people are able to leverage the diversity in their organizations, there are more benefits and opportunities than challenges and losses. And so we know that when organizations are age inclusive, that they are able to recruit and retain an age diverse workforce and really foster an environment that is cooperative and where people from different generations are able to learn from one another. And I think that this is a strategy that's really important for practitioners when working with organizations, that these are concepts that we reinforce, because it's really vital that we understand that there is learning reciprocity in our age diversity. And I think also importantly, to understand that young professionals coming into the field have much more to offer than technological skills. And very often you see models of reverse mentoring or people motivated to bring on young talent because they believe that that's going to help with improving technology with some of the older cohorts. And while that may be true, it's really important to not stereotype or develop a real single story about the talent that young professionals bring to a field. The research is really clear that millennials have really identified that they bring a diverse skill set in terms of their collaborative skills, project management, leadership, as well as expertise within their field. I often use the example of a teacher who, for a seasoned teacher who's been in the classroom 20, 30 years, we know that they have a lot in terms of their own experience and professional development, that they have a lot to offer a teacher who's entering the classroom for the first time. But also that teacher who's entering the classroom for the first time, who's just finished their degree, has had access to the most recent research in pedagogy and new approaches to learning and development, and that being able to share that with teachers who've been in the classroom for a long time is equally valuable. So it really is about organizations understanding that each person, regardless of their age, is bringing a unique set of talent, and to really leverage those skills to help everybody within the organization learn, and to do that intergenerationally and of course cross-functionally as well.
May I interrupt you very quickly?
Sure.
We have a question from Christina, which is, what are some concrete steps a company can take to build this environment?
Okay, so I think I might get to those closer to the end. I'm gonna try to outline those specifically, but in case Christine has to go and I miss it, let me suggest that one of the first things I talk about, really recommend to organizations, is developing mutual mentoring relationships. And this is about putting together two people together for the purpose of mentoring, where they're both mentoring the other on different aspects of their work. I think cross-training is also another opportunity. And then, of course, in terms of the work that we do, training is essential. So I'm quite certain that age bias is really one of the still really socially acceptable form of bias and discrimination. I know for many of us, when we think about the way that people talk about young people or old people, very often is that challenged or criticized or even considered biased or discriminatory. Because very often people are told, you're too young, you don't know anything, you're too old, you're irrelevant, questioning people's ability to work with technology because of their age, questioning whether or not somebody has the longevity within an organization because of their age, right? If they're too young, they're not going to be interested. If they're too old, they're going to really retire. And so the way that we talk about the old and the young in organizations and in society and our cultures in general is pretty biased. And so really raising organizations' awareness to this bias is really important. And I will say that for within ourselves, one of the things that I really challenged myself to do in the last year was to not use age bias language with myself. So when we think about all the time, we think, oh, I'm so old, or, oh, when I bend over and I make a noise, right? We have these ways in which we age ourselves and we apply those bias to our own identity that can limit us in our own thinking and in our own approach to our work and in our relationships with other people. So those are three really concrete steps, I think. Mentoring, cross-training, and training, I think, are really vital. And when organizations do that, they're really going to be able to be much more agile and responsive to that VUCA environment and that new economy. They're going to be able to increase intention, engagement, and the performance of their new talent. I've gone into organizations and they've got the, casual sitting areas and the pool tables and the beer fridges. And I really don't think that's what makes people want to go to work every day. I think people want to go to work when they're respected, when they're accepted, when they're validated, when they're challenged and encouraged to learn and grow. And being able to provide that environment for all of our workers is really important. This concept that young people should come into the workplace and sit and be quiet until they've earned their time is really an old strategy that no longer works in this VUCA environment. There's no time, right? Things are moving. Organizations have to be agile and adaptive. And if they're not, employees will leave because other organizations will take them, or they can go to their computer and start their own business. The environment is different and people are responding to that. And that's really important. And when organizations are able to do that, then they're then able to sustain a competitive edge and support the development and career growth of their teams, strengthen their own organizational intelligence, and build sustainable communities of knowledge. When you have that mentoring and that cross-training, you're really able to sort of diversify and increase that knowledge base within an organization. And that's really, really crucial to organizations being able to grow and scale and be sustainable. And then, of course, that knowledge transfer is invaluable for succession planning and for organization sustainability. So in terms of what we know as intercultural practitioners, how does this apply? And so early on in my work, I took the definitions that we use about culture and I looked at how they could apply to what we know about generations. And so this is a definition of culture that I've been using for a very long time that I think is a hybrid of the various definitions we've seen in our own scholarship. And then looked at how does that apply to generational differences. And so we know I've had people tell me, oh, Tamara, I don't know why you talk about generations so much. There's nothing that's different. I don't 100% agree with that, but I also don't think everything is about age difference. But it's really like culture, sort of understanding what are the layers. What is someone's personality? What's their local culture? What's their national culture? What are all the different things that influence and shape people's values, beliefs, and behaviors? And so these generational information doesn't replace any of those, but it certainly adds another layer to what we as intercultural practitioners understand about how our values and beliefs and behaviors are shaped and informed by our environment and the people around us. And in terms of one of the terminology that started to emerge in literature a few years back around generational differences was this idea of generational competence. And so when I first saw that, I went to look at, well, what's the definition of intercultural competence that I rely on? This is the one that Darla Deardorff painstakingly worked to develop after speaking with lots of interculturalists. It's this ability to communicate and behave effectively and appropriately in intercultural situations based upon one's own knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And then having the flexibility to select and use culturally appropriate communication and behavior. And so I substituted intercultural for generational. And it really is the same. I think it holds true that we really want the ability to communicate and behave appropriately in intergenerational situations based on the generational knowledge, skills, and attitudes that we have. And that it's important, whether it's culture or age difference, that we think about our differences in a much more complex way. So when people have said to me, oh, well, millennials are so, what are all the things? They're so arrogant, and they're impatient, and they're over ambitious. They're entitled, right? All the adjectives that have been used, by the way, to describe every generational cohort since this information started being documented. They've just added more entitled than the previous generation. It's really important that we understand that these are judgments that aren't really well informed. They're judgments and they're stereotypes, and that we can't rely on those concepts. We can't rely on our individual experiences to paint a brush over the millions of millennials that there are around the world, and also including Gen Zs that are now entering the workforce. We have to think about these differences in a much more complex way, the way we do around gender, sexual orientation, and culture. And then when we do this, it really allows us to more accurately interpret behavior, understand those value differences that are influencing behavior, and make different choices about our own behavior so that organizations are able to develop working relationships where people from all ages are able to accept those differences and behave appropriately and effectively with one another. So within organizations, when we hear that complaints, well, you know, millennials don't answer their phone, or they don't respond to email, and this is a reality because there's a value difference around how we value different forms of technology. This isn't a stand by an entire generation to be obstinate. It's that how we value technology is different based upon when different technological tools became a resource for you. I'm a Gen Xer, and Gen Xers are notoriously bad for overusing email. So in a lot of workshops, I have to encourage Gen Xers to stop using email so much because a lot of emails, particularly emails that are less than 2 or 3 sentences, really aren't worthy of being an email. Those are things that we should be texting now or using other kind of texting platforms like WhatsApp or Slack. But these are things that we have to think about more complexly and navigate and negotiate those in the workplace, because they're more complex than they have been talked about in the media, for sure. And in most organizations, generational differences are talked about in a very simple way when they are more complex. So I want to talk a little bit about how they are more complex. This is one of my favorite quotes, right? We all have the same needs, but how we satisfy those needs is different. So when people say that millennials are over ambitious, everybody's ambitious. Everybody wants to be promoted. Everybody wants to work hard. Everybody wants work-life balance. Everyone wants to feel competent, rewarded, and engaged at work. These are not new. These are not different. These are needs that people in the workplace have always had and still have, and how we go about achieving them is slightly different depending upon when you were raised in the world today. So let's talk about what shapes generational differences. I want to give credit to Juana Amaria, who is a consultant at Language and Culture Worldwide. She conducted a research looking at millennials across the globe, and also looking at what shapes and informs the values, beliefs, and behaviors of a specific generational cohort. And in her research, she used this model that looks at 3 influences. And those 3 influences are the life cycle effect, the period effect, and the cohort effect. So very quickly, I'll say that the life cycle effect refers to one's current position in life, right? So that we all know as teenagers, or people in their 20s, or people in their 30s or 40s, there is something common. There's something very common about being a teenager. Whether you were a teenager today or a teenager 50 years ago, there's a certain shared experience that people have as teens. Or in your 20s when you're finding yourself and entering the workforce, or when you're in your 30s and 40s and forming your family and entering midlife. These are common experiences that no matter which generation you were in, there's something about your life cycle, the kind of cycle in life you're in, that informs your generational values, beliefs, and behaviors. The other is what we call the period effect, and that is what refers to what was happening at the time in which you came of age. And so when you look at the slide in front of you, we're looking at what is considered some period effects. What were events, what were environments and conditions that were happening for different generational cohorts that informed how they saw the world and how they engage and interact with the world. And lots of people have asked me about Gen Z, and Gen Zs are still quite young, and there hasn't been a lot of research about how they engage in the workplace, because a lot of them have not started to enter the workforce yet. But there is a lot of data in terms of how they're identifying, in terms of engaging with the world, social concepts. And I think that we all know from popular media that this generation sees the world and their role as activists in it very differently than my generation, for sure, and maybe a little bit more so than millennials. I will also say that this idea of generational differences and preference to the older generation is consistent as millennials are starting to age. Millennials are starting to show and express concerns about Gen Zs entering the workplace, and how this over technological generation will even function when they have to work with real people in the office. And so it's important for us to catch ourselves in these kind of bias that we form, because if we hold those bias, then all behaviors we see reinforce that bias or stereotype we have. So it's important that we understand these influences. So for example, a criticism of millennials is that they are disloyal to organizations because they won't stay. But it's important when you talk to millennials and you ask millennials why they don't trust organizations, it's because they saw their parents lose their jobs during the recession, that they had parents who and members of their community who had been with an organization for 20, 30 years in the recession hit, they all lost their jobs. And we have seen that organizations care less and less about people and social responsibility, two things that are very important to millennials and Gen Z coming up. And with that, organizations are not trusted. And I don't think that that's an inaccurate assessment when we look at how organizations have behaved and are behaving. To see them as not trustworthy isn't a radical thought. So this generation is much more agile and willing to adapt and adjust and move out from something and experience they don't trust. And so we really, like, as I said, it's thinking about these differences more complexly, and to just label them disloyal is selling them short, or really not understanding how difference works. And then I also want to say in Juana Amaria's work, she also looked at this on a global scale. So that we know that a lot of the research is coming out of North America. There is more and more generational research in the UK and the rest of Europe. And then there is, and then of course there is significant global variation because of what has informed that. So we know that millennials in China, they are the children of the first generation of the one-child rule. And so how that has shaped and informed their identity and how they engage in society is very different than prior generations. And so, because people ask me all the time, is this different around the world? 100%. When we understand what informs generational differences, looking at that life cycle, the period, and the cohort effect, then we look at, then we can recognize, right, that within Europe, when the recession hit, it had a significant impact on those in Southern Europe compared to those further north. And so how that shaped their own identity is really different. I was just in the Ukraine, and you could see such a stark difference between the older and younger generation in so many ways, because you have a generation that was born after the fall of the Soviet Union, and so these are a generation that see the world very differently than those who came before them. So it's important that when we are facilitating these conversations around age difference, that we also have conversations about how these different perspectives were informed, and what events and life experiences really shaped how these different generational cohorts see the world. So going back to what Christina had asked about what are specific things we can do. We know that as intercultural practitioners, part of our work is facilitating conversations about difference, but really helping teams start with where they have commonality. So where are things that we have in common that we can build on that then strengthen our capacity to explore our differences. And so I've tried to identify for you in terms of similarities that boomers and millennials both have grown up during a time of war and chaos, and they feel quite comfortable in that uncertainty. Both generations also identify as agents of change or social change makers. And I think that this is these are areas that can be built on. Now, how each of them has chose to be responsive to these two things is different, but in terms of values and beliefs, those are shared values and beliefs that they have that can be built upon. For traditionalists and millennials, these are two generations that came of age after a recession, and that uncertainty and that came with uncertainty and job insecurity. So this kind of fragility and responsiveness around the recession, you know, millennials are criticized because they're not buying houses and they're not going to restaurants and they're not doing all of these things that are supposedly killing the economy. But they're a frugal generation. This is a generation that is really trying to figure out what is the best investment for their money. And after watching the real estate bubble burst in the United States, it certainly isn't real estate where they feel their money is going to be safely invested. So that is, those are some really common values that they share with our oldest generation. And then Gen Xers and Millennials both strive for a work-life balance, and they're ambitious and they're eager to learn. So these are experiences that can be built upon between these generations and millennials. And then, of course, there's a set of shared values based upon those shared experiences. And so boomers and millennials who see themselves as self-reliant and collaborators, traditionalists and millennials who can really use technology. Because remember, very often when we have conversations about technology, we think about digital technology, but we have to remember that there's been all sorts of technology that has changed how we all work. And so different generations have learned to be more responsive to different forms of technology that make our life better. And I think also one of the things you'll see here on this slide is that status is important for every generation. And how we go about acquiring status is really different. So these are really important things for us to think about in terms of when we talk about, you know, who gets what title and who gets what benefit and who gets rewarded when, that this is perceived differently for every generation. But going back to that quote by Jack Condon, we all have the same need, right? We all have the same need for status and position and reward and recognition, but that's going to look different. And despite what tech companies want people to believe, having a beer fridge at work isn't what's making people feel rewarded and having status in the workplace. So values that we see come into conflict quite commonly are work ethic, and everybody has a work ethic, but what that work ethic means is different. Gen Xers' work ethic is pretty straightforward. We work 9 to 5, we work our hours, we do our time, and then we go home. Boomers and millennials work overtime. And millennials probably more so than any other generation because they're more fluid in their approaches to work, with working on their laptops and on their cell phones. So they, the research has shown that they're putting in more hours than most. Perceptions of hierarchy, communication modalities that I talked about. When do we email? When do we text? These are values that organizations need to address. And then also, of course, reward and promotion, that work-life balance, and then work environments. What do we want the work environment to look like? Do we want it to be hierarchical? Does it need to be more flattened? Does it need to be traditional? And here's the thing that I stress all the time. This isn't about everybody bending to the will of the younger generation. It's about understanding how our differences show up and then helping organizations navigate and negotiate those differences so they're able to find approaches that work for everybody. So some age inclusion strategies that I mentioned before is about adding age in your unconscious bias training programs, fostering generational competence by having conversations about generational differences at a values level, and then facilitating the negotiation of those value conflicts, right? So how do you want to be rewarded? What things do we send by email? Which things do we send on text? If I call you, you know, how quickly should I respond? These are things that teams really have to negotiate. And then, of course, we want to encourage intergenerational collaboration through mutual mentoring and cross-training. So that is it. I'm quite impressed with my ability to be on time. That rarely happens. So we now have the opportunity. I know I gave you a lot of content in a very short period of time, but we'll open the floor up to questions now.
We have already a question by Jimena. She said, is it possible to share the study you were mentioning before from Anne-Marie?
Oh, from Juana Amaria. Yes, I believe I have a copy, and we can make it available wherever this webinar is posted after the webinar.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions? You can type in and we're going to read them. I have a question for you, if that's possible.
Yes.
So you were starting the webinar talking about the discrimination happening based on age, which starts from the very beginning of the recruitment. Have you noticed or witnessed, or have you given any trainings to the recruitment team for them to change their biased perception? How do you see organization coping with the very first step of adding people to the organization, which is the recruitment team?
Yeah, I think that I specifically have been had the opportunity to work with different people in human resources, which I find tends very often to be millennials. That has been my experience, and I think it's two ways. I think it's important, right, that cultures within organizations are very often driven by the people at the top. And so I think that that's really important. But I also think then in terms of when we look at bias within organizations, recognizing that very often that comes at the earliest stages in recruitment is also important. I have been on lots of teams, hiring committees and hiring teams. And I know in my own practice, when I get a resume, I look at, okay, when did they go to university? And I mentally try to calculate to anticipate their age. And this is something that I have done for, throughout my career. And it's not that it's wrong, but it's then how do you evaluate that information, right? So if you come up with a number, then how does that number inform your choices? And over time, I've really had to learn to identify the judgments that I have with that, right? And this idea that people who are too old won't stay, or people who are too young won't stay, that's not the reality. The research has been really clear that millennials want to stay in one workplace, but they won't stay if they're not supported or challenged or encouraged to grow professionally.
Thank you. Another question is from Veronica. She is asking, how will a good training design for generation be?
So thank you for asking this. This is a really important question. I think that, like we know from any intercultural training, that you don't want to spend too much time talking about generation-specific differences at a superficial level, because that can get you into the weeds very quickly. So I think it's important that you start with some of the culture general information first. So when we look at introducing concepts of culture and looking at concepts of age and generational differences, what that looks like. So for early on, I used to start the trainings with a activity looking explicitly at generational differences. And I learned very quickly that organizations and teams can't go into that too soon. So now I do design really based around life cycle and that idea of what was life like for you in your teens, your 20s, your 30s, your 40s. And that allows people to kind of connect with their own individual experiences. And then we look at larger concepts around generational competence, age bias, and understanding that age bias comes for every age group, right? As that, you know, when women are coming into the workplace at a certain age, people wonder, are they going to get pregnant, right? That this isn't something that just happens to millennials or just happens to boomers. This is something that affects all of us. And in my diversity and inclusion work, I always live by the principle that what is a problem for one is a problem for all. So this is something that everybody's invested in. So I think in terms of training design, that it's really making sure that those foundational pieces are there. It's also important to link these to their own organizational values. And then once there's a nice foundation, you can then go into those more generational specific differences and move them into a values level as quickly as possible. So they understand this isn't about people making conscious behaviors to be difficult, but that the values and beliefs around it are really different. Why do some people trust technology more than others? This is an important values question to explore before you go too deeply, because people get really caught up in the behavior. Why do they act this way? When really the question should be, what belief and value do they have that shows up in this way? So that's what I would suggest. Really find a way for people to connect, understand that it affects everybody, provide some cultural general foundations on larger concepts of difference, and bias and discrimination and inclusion, and then move into the more generational specific values and behaviors that need to be negotiated.
Thank you, Tamara. Cordula is asking, what do you see as the most important area or areas for companies for managing that intergenerational challenge?
I think, well, I think the most important thing is that organizations invest in the work that needs to be done, right? So when I talked about having training and allowing opportunities for mentoring and cross-training, I think these are really vital. And if organizations, we see this all the time, if organizations aren't investing in their leaders, if they're not really investing in the diversity and inclusion training that they need, if they're not investing in the training that needs to be done, they're really not going to be able to do it. So from my perspective, I think what's most important for organizations is that they accept that there's a learning curve here and that they need to invest. And just like with any other forms of diversity, there's a real opportunity for organizations to have those multiple generational perspectives and the talent and to leverage it to their benefit.
Vanessa is saying, really interesting, thank you. Do you think we talk about generations a lot these days, but that is always have been part of the workplace? We're just starting to label the different groups.
So I will say yes and no. So I think that, as I said at the beginning of the webinar, today we are seeing more generations in the workplace because people are entering sooner and leaving later. So that's, the research is very clear about that. I know when I entered the workforce, there were very few people who were of an older third generation, but that the predominant workforce was really two generations that weren't divided by very much difference. Today, we, as I said, we have a much larger age spread within organizations because people are aren't leaving at 55, people aren't leaving at 65. Earlier research that I found suggested, I think it was that most people over 65 expect to work at least part-time for another 10, 15 years, or they start new careers at 65. And I think, and then of course that the environment is much more volatile and rapid changing, and it's making some of our differences much more apparent. And so, yes, are we talking about it more, and is it for real reasons? Yes. Is it the most critical diversity issue organizations are facing today? Absolutely not. People have been, engaging with people who are older and younger and of different age for them for a very long time. But it certainly is in terms of how organizations become more competent in their ability to work across difference. This is one of those strata that they should be addressing. But I certainly think that it is, if we know that millennials are the most researched generation of all time, and then many now people are referring to Gen Z as millennials because it's now just become the term for that new generation we don't understand or like or want in the workplace. And so I just want to encourage, not that we have more conversation about it, but when we do have conversations about it, that conversation is more sophisticated and more complex.
Thank you, Tamara. We have two last questions, and I want to be a little bit time conscious because we have 4 minutes left and a poll to run. This is a question starting from Dora and then followed by Steve. Hi, Tamara. Thank you for sharing so much useful information. I was wondering whether you could share a few real-life examples, maybe one, or anecdotes of situations in organizations that were problematic and they were helped to level things out among generations. And following up on Dora's questions, examples of organizations that have truly demonstrated intergenerational competencies and how they were brought to that.
Okay, so the first is a real world example. So two challenges that come to mind that typically is the quickest and easiest resolved is around communication modalities. So millennials complain about the overabundance of emails they receive, and boomers and traditionalists will complain that their emails aren't getting read and that they just keep getting texts all the time. And so this is something that creates a lot of judgment and conflict. And when I've been able to sit down with teams and we go through the modalities and what our values are around them and when they should be used, it makes a huge difference. It's really, really important for leaders to know that millennials and Gen Z are not reading your emails at all, ever. Very rarely. It is not their primary mode of communication. They're not creating folders or subfolders or organizing them or prioritizing. That's just not happening. If they're responding to emails, they're doing it begrudgingly. While the rest of us use emails in a much more sophisticated way. So these are things I would say is probably one of the more easier things to navigate. Issues around hierarchy and authority are much more complex, and those come up and those take a bit more time because how younger generations perceive hierarchy and authority are quite different. And so those take a bit more coaching and a bit more nuancing for people to really understand how those work. And what was the last question, Gradiola?
An example, well, we have 2 more questions, but I'm afraid we're going to have to skip them. It was from Steve, an example of an organization who has done proper intergenerational competence.
I don't know. I would say that there are organizations that are very good at publishing information about intergenerational work, but I don't know that any one organization has been touted for how successfully they do it. I know in the United States, Walmart is often heralded as an example, and also McDonald's, that are 2 organizations that do quite a bit of marketing to demonstrate how they bring old and young people together in the workplace, but I haven't seen any real data on how successful those models are.
Okay, thank you very much, Tamara. Edith and Almendra, I would really recommend you to write to one of the social media or just email to Tamara your questions.
Let me put those back up.
And please bear with us another minute for us to share a poll to see what do you think about this webinar, how did you like it, and how you can give us some feedback to make it better next time. And in the meantime, I would like you also to join us in the next webinar, which is happening on the 15th of November with Bastian Kunzel in Immense Training Program Design with a Learner's Journey. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much, Tamara, for sharing this wonderful webinar, and everybody for being so active with questions and staying with us till the very end.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
The poll disappeared. Okay,
I think that's my fault.
Okay, I am relaunching the poll.
I think I put it back.
Okay.
I put it back. Sorry, I had too much power.
Okay, 100% of the people voted. So thank you very much. I'm going to end the poll, and we look forward to seeing you to the next webinar then.
Thank you, everybody.
And thank you, Steve, for helping us with the technician part. Very much appreciated.